Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few extra dollars in your wallet. Today, we are going to talk about why you don't want a Stimmie. And this is probably going to be a sensitive topic for a lot of people. And so let's start off this podcast with a cocktail. And as has been discussed, this is a Sunday afternoon conversation. And this one probably requires a drink. So I'm going to pour myself a drink. I highly recommend you do the same because as I tell you why you don't want a Stimmie, you might get a little upset. All right, drinks poured. We can get underway and start talking about how all of us want free money and how we think that there's a free lunch. So the recent New York Times article says that 80% of Americans support the new stimulus check. And today is a perfect opportunity for discussing this because today is February 28th, and on Friday, late in the afternoon, I'm sure without reading the thing, the House passed another $1.9 trillion spending bill, giving potentially $1,600 checks to every American who makes less than $75,000. Now, along with this, I just wanted to check in, and I'm saying 80% of people think that they should get a free check. That bothers me because there's nothing free. If we've learned anything in the digital age over the last 20 years with Google and Facebook, we realize that free is not free, right? Okay, the service is free. What's that mean? It means that they're selling your info and they're collecting that instead. So if the government's sending you a check and apparently that's free, what's the real catch? And the catch is inflation. The catch is your government spending tons more money on a whole lot of other things than just giving you a check. And oh yeah, by the way, they're spending money they don't have. I.e., we don't have, because it's our country and therefore it's our debt. So, a little quick side trip here into financial education. And less than 35% of people in America can answer 4 or 5 basic financial literacy questions. I mean, we're talking basic questions to understand financial math. Well, if 65% of the country is uneducated, then of course they want a free check because they literally believe it's free. And most people will take something today for giving up something tomorrow. Well, how does this work out then? It's not surprising at all that everyone wants a free lunch. However, no such thing. So the question is, when's this bill going to come due and how are we going to pay for it? Or how are we not going to pay for it, but pay for it? So here's my top 4 reasons that you don't want a Stimmie. The first one is there's a whole lot of pork attached to that Stimmie check. So the December 2020 stimulus bill had about 1/3 of just straight bacon on it. And we're going to go into what that means when your government's handing out money to who they decide are the winners and losers in this thing and who's getting free cheese all the time. And I'm not talking about people getting unemployment money. I'm not talking about actual stimulus checks going to Americans. I'm talking about all the rest of it. Second reason, you don't ask broke people for money. Anyone who has family members who they know are broke, in debt up to their eyeballs, can barely make the payments each month, they don't go ask those people for a big fat loan. But that's what you're doing with your government. Your government's broke. They don't have the money. So there's only one way they're going to get it, and that's by printing it. And that has a lot of adverse long-term consequences to all of us in society. Reason number 3, inflation has, is, and will exacerbate inequality. Taxation without representation hurts us all, especially those who don't already own assets, and especially those who don't have debt. And this is going to catch a lot of people by surprise. Also, just as a side note, and if you've been listening to any of my podcasts on history, you'll understand this because I frequently say it, The reason this country was founded was taxation without representation. Well, inflation is exactly that, taxation without representation. So, inflation is reason number 3. And reason number 4 is there's a massive moral hazard going on here. And it's going to take away from all of our prosperity because we're not going to allow the free market to work correctly. Creative destruction is a necessary part of the free market system. And when we take creative destruction away from the free market system, i.e., we don't allow companies that should fail to fail, we allow people to take on excess risk because the financial system is now operating with basically zero interest, which means money is in fact theoretically free to borrow, which means speculation's at an all-time high. What could go wrong? Well, a lot of things, and I'm going to show you how they have in the past. So let's start out with our stimulus bill full of bacon. And make no mistake, the politicians are happier than pigs in shit. And I mean, seriously, this is what they love to do. So if you look at what politicians want, more than anything in the world, is to have power. Okay? So the power that they have sitting in Congress, where they spend most of their time just trying to get reelected and raising more money to get reelected again, is power. And they want this power and they crave this power. And spending is the ultimate form of how they release this power. They get to control where government money goes. So we take a quick look at the December 2020 stimulus bill that Donald Trump didn't want to sign because he said, hey, this thing's so full of pork, why don't we just give all of this money directly to people? So $900 billion was the package that they passed. So that was $166 million in direct checks, 120 billion in direct checks. That's a typo in there. That should be a B, not an M. We're not talking in millions here, people. We're talking in billions and trillions. And I know none of us can understand these numbers because they're so damn big. That's what we're dealing with. So it's 166 billion in direct checks, 120 billion for unemployment, which probably is the only thing that we actually needed to pass, and 325 billion for small businesses. And that one may have needed to pass too. If you shut businesses down and don't allow them to operate, then you should pay their expenses. I mean, otherwise, that's pretty much a taking and, in my mind, unconstitutional against the law. But as far as I'm concerned at this point, the Constitution's a nice document sitting in a museum and not something that our country actually believes in and follows. That's just my opinion at this point. Take it for what you will. So let's add all that up. So 3, 4, 5, we actually get to close to 600 billion of actual money going to American citizens for unemployment, direct checks, and small business help. Okay, that seems reasonable. What about the other 1/3 of the package? Where's that going? Oh, pork. And if you want to follow, if you'd like to know where it goes, click right here, go to the Politico ad. It goes to all sorts of basically special interest groups, including foreign governments and all sorts of funny things that have nothing to do with the problems that we have going on right now from COVID, and nothing that affects actual American people, but where your government's going to spend the money. And they like to hand it out all over the place to, yes, of course, you guessed right, the people who help them get elected once again. So now what about this new $1.9 trillion bill that they're passing right now? $413 billion for household checks, $246 billion for unemployment, which could be a moral hazard at the amounts that they're giving out because they're basically paying people more to do nothing than they are to work. Who wants to work when you're paying me more not to, and I don't have to do anything? Now, I agree we should help people who are unemployed, and our unemployment numbers are astrological. However, add this up, about 650 billion. That's about 1/3 of what they're spending. So where's the rest of it going? Once again, bacon, bacon, bacon. Just to all their special interest groups. And this is always the politician's trick. They make you think you're getting the money, but in reality, you're getting 1/3 of it. So if we really wanted to hand out stimulus checks to everybody, then let's send all the money to citizens. Forget about the rest of this. Why is the government choosing where else government goes? Because the government's great at choosing how things should go? Oh, no, look around. They're not. Everything they do, they screw up. So it's not like these are geniuses who have decided this is the best place for bang for our buck on our money. Absolutely not. This is just additional political handouts to whoever they want, wherever they want. Terrible. All right. Second, you don't ask broke people for money. All right. You just don't. It's rude. All right. So here's our government national debt. And if you want to find that out, just Google U.S. national debt clock, and that one's going. So you see, we're getting real close because I pulled this earlier today, and it's ticking up at a very fast rate, right? Death per taxpayer. 200 debt per taxpayer. Oh my gosh. I can't even read this. It's so crazy. $223,000 per U.S. citizen. That's what we owe. Okay? That's what is going right now. Right? So by the end of today, it's probably over 28 trillion because it's pretty damn close right now. All right. So annual receipts are actually about 3.45 trillion. Right? Now, there's these fancy math people who think they're going to raise taxes, and I'm not even going to pull up that chart. I'll talk about that in a future podcast. But realistically, it doesn't matter when the government raises rates. They collect about the same amount every year, regardless, as a percentage of GDP. So right now, it's about 3.45 trillion. Right? Now, here's the simple math. Right? We owe 28 trillion. Okay? So if we wanted to pay that back, we'd need 9 years of the government spending zero and doing nothing but paying debt. So we're 9 years of our future given away, but that's with no federal government doing anything. And we all know that's not going to happen because mandatory expenditures on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security and defense spending is over 3.1 trillion. Okay, so what we're left with, we could pay off debt with, right? Oh, wait a minute. We owe another 392 billion for the interest on the debt. And if you add that to the 3.1 trillion, that's more than the money coming in. So, if you were a household and this was your situation where, knock a few zeros off, but you're in the same spot where all of your income for the year is already spent just paying the rent for food, making the car payment, and not taking a vacation and paying the interest on the credit card and other debts that you have, you're what's known as broke. And we all know what this situation looks like. We all know people in it. Well, guess what? We're all in it. Our federal government is in it. And this is where we stand today. So, they want us to keep spending more than they make and borrowing more than ever. Oh, nice typo in there. Sorry. Because it also has a lot of other expenses. Like Stimmie checks. Okay, so we don't have money, and then we're going to go on a shopping spree. So the broke person who already has enough credit card debt where all their money goes to just paying basic bills and interest is going to go out and spend more money on their credit card. What could go wrong? Except for, also, last year was the worst, i.e. the highest amount of debt in U.S. history. More than 4 trillion. Right? And let's make no mistake about that. If we want to talk any partisan politics whatsoever, this was Republicans in power who ran up the highest federal deficit ever. Right? And if the Republicans were the Republicans of the party that, when I was young, that were supposed to be against fiscal deficits and responsible government spending, then there would be none of this. None of this would have happened to begin with. And oh yeah, by the way, all the debts that were accrued over the last 4 years, why they had a Republican president and Republican Congress, what are they blaming those on? They can't act like they inherited the worst economy ever. This isn't 2009 when Barack Obama walks into office and the whole country and the banking system is about to fall apart because of the housing crisis, because of speculation. And we can get into, again, the government creating this, but it doesn't matter. We are at the worst point in history for U.S. debt, and we're going to take on more, and all of these Stimmie checks just add to it. So there's a difference between helping people who need help and writing stimulus checks for money you don't have. Anyone who's broke and has a bunch of credit card debt, no one's personal advice to them is, you know what you should do today? Go take on more debt. Go run up a bigger debt. Because, who cares? Now, it's possible if you have a lot of credit card debt, someone's advice might be, hey, you might as well max out your credit limit. And this is what we're going to find out when the federal government gets to its credit limit and then declare bankruptcy. But what happens if the government declares bankruptcy? I have no idea. All sorts of things go south. Bondholders take a big bath. Well, who's that? Oh, that's probably mostly our pension funds. Bunch of other foreign governments who won't believe in the U.S. currency after that and won't want to trade with us right now. All sorts of horrible consequences. So the government can't pay back the current money it owes. So what's it going to do? How does it borrow money when you're broke? Well, you print it and you increase the supply of money, which increasing the supply of money is also the definition of inflation, which I covered in a previous podcast on inflation. And if you want to learn more about that, it's a very complicated topic. I'm still trying to get my hands around it right now. But basically, the simple definition is just an increased supply. And that's what they're doing. All right, so inflation destruction's bad for almost everybody. And I'm continuing to talk about the government debt because this is where we're going to end up with, right? So this is from Horizon Kinetics Q4 2020 review. And Horizon Kinetics is an investment house, and they're fairly conservative, value-driven investors who actually believe in companies that make money. And here's a little bit of what they had to say. If the economy cannot expand sufficiently to allow the debt to GDP ratio to gradually subside to a sustainable level, which we've already discussed it's not, the government's only political realistic option, a time-worn solution, is to actually continue printing more money. By expanding the money supply sufficiently over years or decades, the government arranges that there will be more dollars in everyone's pocket, each one worth less, but more of them. The borrowers within society are thereby enabled to gradually pay off their fixed obligations, i.e. debts, meaning the bonds or bond ETFs that you as an investor might hold in the ever more plentiful dollars, while the holders of those obligations are stuck with the same value as last year or 10 years ago. And what they're talking about when they say are stuck with the same value, they're talking about you're stuck with the same purchasing power. So right now, if you were to buy a 10-year government bond, it's basically going to pay you 1% interest, which means at the end of 10 years, the buying power, if you hold it to maturity and get your money back, is going to be a whole lot less than what it is right now. So you would be silly, some might even say stupid, to give your money to the government at said rates right now. And I agree with that 100%. You don't want to be in bonds right now, with the exception of playing games that you believe there's going to be a short deflationary period before the inflation kicks in. Because the inflation's going to kick in. There's really no way around it at this point, and I'm about to show you why. So, the opposite side of this is that debt is good for those taking it out, because they're going to pay it back in future dollars that are worth less because there's more of them. Okay? So, homeowners, this is why I recommend refinancing your mortgage. Take out as much as you can. Lock in a low rate for 30 years. That's going to become an asset for you. Businesses with debt, those with assets that they can borrow against, i.e. wealthy people, and it's bad for everyone else, all savers, pensioners, and bondholders. This is bad for, because what happens is you give people your money at cheap rates, inflation takes away your borrowing power, and when you get your money back, it buys less. Who wants that deal? Nobody. And this is a major problem, and I'll continue to discuss. So, money supply versus inflation, right? So if we talk about the government spending money, right, then we're going to talk about inflation. Or not spending money so much, but spending money they don't have, which requires printing money. All right, so this is the M2 money supply versus inflation, and this is where the link to where I got this graph from, and it's interactive. It's kind of cool. You can go play with it and change the time period on it. And I just put it for the last 110 years. So if you looked at all the times in history, and the gray line that you see running through there, which is actually black, but when you snip it becomes gray for whatever reason, that's the increase in the money supply. And the red line is inflation. And so as you can see, it's not perfectly correlated, but because inflation has to deal with more than just the money supply, right? has to do with people spending it. So if people don't spend it because they're saving it, because they're worried about retirement, then that money's not spent gets back and therefore doesn't increase prices. But what happens when people do spend it and are worried about inflation? So if we look at the major periods where the government spent money, okay, so we've got war periods in here, 30s and 40s. Government spent lots of money, echo effect, it kind of takes a while, but boom, there you see it. Inflation, inflation, inflation. So government printing, inflation, government printing, inflation. And there are periods, so in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, where the government was printing money, people weren't necessarily spending it because they were worried about not having enough during the Great Depression. But all of a sudden you get into the 40s, the government's spending money because of the war effort, and boom, what do you see? Inflation, almost directly attached. It takes a little while for it to filter through, but it eventually does. We see the same thing in the 40s, right? We have inflation in the 50s without even the government printing that much money, right? And then we enter a bunch of stability. But in the 60s, the government starts printing money again. Now, inflation doesn't take off until the 70s. But in the 70s, once it takes off, you can see the inflation spikes come heavy and come hard, right? All the way up until the 1980s, when they significantly increased rates, but we were on a 10% inflation rate. Now, they tell us it's been down since then, right? But we're not so certain that it really has. Because here's the other piece that they steal from us in inflation data. They steal our prosperity. Because while the money supply is increasing, if they weren't doing that, costs on goods would actually go down. And no better example of that than your cellular phone in your pocket. That cellular phone in your pocket used to cost thousands of dollars just for the phone, plus $10 a minute to operate, plus you had to carry it around a briefcase. Now that's got a camera that's effectively a DSLR camera, which would have cost you thousands of dollars. And 30 years ago, that's got a mainframe-sized computer in it that would have cost you $100,000 and filled up a room. So all of that is shrunk into something you carry around in your pocket and costs $1,000. However, it would cost a whole lot less than that if it wasn't for the government printing money all the time. So our prices are up because of inflation, and therefore they're also taking away our improvements in productivity, because that's what we entrepreneurs do. We make things cheaper. That's the good part of a free economic society. So now we see all of a sudden the last year specifically, and look at this fat, amazingly huge increase in money supply. It is amazing. So in this one, I've shrunk the graph down to 30 years instead of the whole period. And holy cow, look what they did last year. They increased the money supply by 25%. And they told us there's no inflation. Do you believe that? Makes me need a drink. Wow. How did they do that? Holy cow. How much money did they really print? So, when do we expect this next big jump in inflation to happen? I don't know, but I expect it will be soon. So let's talk about inflation's path of destruction. And I talked about this a little bit in my inflation podcast, but I'm going to reiterate some of those things now. It really contributes to rising inequality because here's what happens. Asset prices get a lot higher, but wages don't, right? Well, that prevents people from gaining enough income to get into investments, i.e., let's just look at the housing market. So if the average home price costs $40,000 and the average wage is $5 an hour, right? Then you need, 8,000 hours of work time to be able to buy a house in easy math, right? But as inflation goes up and the prices go up, wages don't go up with them. And this is what causes our rising inequality. The purchasing power of your labor hour continues to go down. That's what inflation does. So every single worker getting a W-2 loses purchasing power. And the workers who don't get W-2, i.e. the wealthy people who are wealthy already, just making money on their money, they do better. The second part is it completely destroys the pensions and the savers, right? So with the government's high debt, they're forced to keep interest rates low. Well, that hurts the saver because, again, you're not even getting the inflation back on your money because the government's printing so much, which means there's no incentive to save. But how do we save for retirement? And then what do the pension funds do that have to pay people's retirements that are promised by the governments or by institutions? Well, they have to go further out on the risk curve to try and get return instead of just buying government bonds, in which case the pensions would be fine. So, and then when they don't hit their marks, guess what? The pension doesn't have enough money to pay the retirees. And that's the next crisis that's going to be coming, and that one's going to kill us. So you have dual things with pensions. A, the returns aren't high enough, and B, now they're severely underfunded because they haven't met their requirements for growth, because they have to keep going to riskier and riskier assets, and it's harder and harder for them to make money on that. So that means that pensions are basically effectively broke. And if you look around the country right now at state pension systems, they're broke. The other thing is our creative destruction is being destroyed in this, right? And this isn't so much as a cause of inflation, but this is a cause of the government choosing who to send money to. And when we don't allow businesses to fail, when we don't allow people who can't pay their bills to have their cars repossessed, when we don't allow people who can't pay their rent, and I'm not talking about people who can't pay their rent because they lost their job directly related to COVID because the government shut down the business. I'm talking about the people who weren't paying their rent beforehand. I'm talking about the people who weren't paying their mortgage beforehand, the people who were making their car payment beforehand, or the people who don't want to go back to work or just don't want to make those payments. You have to cycle those things back into society and get them into more productive use. This is part of the business cycle. And this is the part where government steps in. They create massive, massive problems because they choose the winners and losers, and they do a horrible, horrible job about it. There's a huge misallocation of resources. This results in lower overall growth and lower productivity for decades to come. And if you think I'm wrong about this, if you want an example, Japan. For the last 30 years, Japan's been on this crazy cycle where they took out all of this debt, and now they have super low growth. They have all of these zombie companies. They have very little increase in productivity, and everyone's life in terms of quality of life has stagnated or gone down and continues to. And Japan continues to struggle with growth. And it's not a surprise. It's because the government's gotten involved. To the extent now that the government in Japan buys stocks. Well, if they keep buying the stocks, then the prices don't go down. So the companies that should fail don't. And that is a major moral hazard and a major problem to productivity and prosperity for all. And I like prosperity for all. Okay, so here's a nice example of how inflation is directly correlated to the money supply, despite the fact that they want to keep telling us that it's not. So here is the M2 money supply, which is basically the money in circulation. So between I don't know how that far that goes back, 1980, is that when it says? 1/11/3/1980. So 1980 to now, so for the last roughly 30 years. Okay, so you see the stock was below this is in billions of dollars. So before it was $2,000 billion. Now it's $20,000 billion. So basically a 10x increase in the money supply. Okay, so that's pretty easy to see. And we go to the next one, and home prices. So home price was starting at around $30,000 30 years ago, and now it's up 10x. They want to say there's no correlation, and we don't have inflation, but inflation in terms of a housing price is almost identically correlated with the M2 money supply. The only delta being 2008, because this was a housing recession, so everything went down because houses got a little ahead of themselves and then came back. However, if you look at the total and those lines, they look eerily similar. Because it makes sense. Because that's that much money chasing houses, and when there's more money chasing houses, they go up in price. More money printed, higher housing prices. So now hopefully you can see how this is really, really bad for people starting out. If you just graduated from college, even if you have no debt, which if you do, you're lucky, or you were smart about it, or you have some debt, or whatever, or you're just a kid starting out who didn't go to college, or you're just basically at zero and trying to get going. Well, now all of a sudden a house costs $360,000. Now let me ask you this. Since 1980, do you think wages have increased 10 times? 10x 1980. So, when I got my first job in 1990, when I was 14, minimum wage was $4.25 an hour. So even if we looked at 1990, and we go back and we look at the money supply, okay, so money supply 1990, we'll call it 4,000. So it's gone up 5x since then. So back then, minimum wage was $4.25 an hour, and a year later, I wasn't on minimum wage. I was probably making $6 to $7 an hour. So now inflation's gone up in terms of the money supply 5x. But that same job that I was getting paid $6 an hour for is not paying $30 an hour today. It's probably paying $15. So the purchasing power for that person, their ability to buy a home based on the average home price, is way, way lower. And this is what I'm talking about, this is the income inequality that is created because wages aren't rising at the same rate. It's just never happens that way. Instead, it's the price of assets, which is, i.e., the wealth that you have. So it's harder to get wealthy. It's harder to earn more. It's hard to get in the game, period, because of this inflation. This is what the government printing money does to everyone. So, in conclusion, if you think you still want a stimulus, then you are also saying that you want, and this is where you're going to need your drink, because this is where your selfishness plays into the society, right? You want rising inequality. So I just showed you how the impact to lower income families is much more extreme, as most of their income is spent on necessities. When those increase in costs, they go hungry. They go homeless. There's a reason that our homeless population is booming right now. It's because housing prices are more expensive than ever. Why is that? We just showed you, because the M2 money supply is greater than ever. Because your government printed money instead of having fiscal responsibility. It means we get higher prices for everything. Except your wages, of course, which never keep pace with inflation. We also get a lack of economic growth and opportunities. When your government chooses winners and losers, they're going to choose poorly. With the politically connected doing well and the poor proliferating, while real productivity, i.e. prosperity for all, suffers. And we all suffer. Because we all do better when there's incentives for entrepreneurs to come lower costs. We do horrible when the government tells us what the best ideas are. Because you know what? They don't have ideas. That's not what politicians are. They're professional liars who spend their entire careers trying to collect money so they can continue to be a politician and continue to lie to everybody. They are not problem solvers. They are not the ones with the best ideas. And if COVID hasn't shown you that, then I don't know what's gonna. And the last one is, and this is what's coming to America, the pension crisis and punishing of savers. And there won't be enough money in the pensions. And that money that is left will be worth less. There'll be more dollars, worth less buying power, forcing retirees to a lower standard of living. And here's the big catch if you're a millennial. Instead of you moving back in with your parents because you can't afford things after college because of your college debt, instead, your parents are moving in with you because their retirement money isn't going nearly as far. And that's what happens when our government prints everybody's stimmies. Hope you enjoyed today. Hope you got a drink in with that one, because that's a rough one. Thank you for listening. Please pass this along to friends and family. You don't want a stimmie. I'm here to tell you why.